Hi, I'm going to be showing you the process by which I transfer a very rough thumbnail sketch onto a final painting surface that I can then work on at a much larger size. So much of my work, I start off by brainstorming thumbnails. These are small little sketches where I'm not so much concentrating on the details or the fine rendering of anything, and more about blocking out the shapes and the composition and how I want the piece to flow. The problem is that once you have this little thumbnail, you have to then translate it into a much larger painting or drawing. And in order to do that, it's a multi-step process that I use. There are multiple ways to do it, but I'm going to show you my method of how I transfer something from this into a much larger size. So first thing I do is I scan this onto my computer, and then on my screen, I work on the piece to really refine the shapes and the flow and correct any errors that I might catch in this early stage. Again, at this point, I'm not so concerned about the rendering and the details, more about the overall form and how everything connects up and flows together. Because this is the stage where you really want to make sure that all of that is set so that once you do start the very time-consuming, highly rendered elements, you don't find that you have some strange anatomical or weird compositional problem happening, because at that point it's much harder to fix. So once I have it in a larger size, I put it onto my screen at the size that I want the final painting to be, which is, in this case, going to be 14.5 inches. So I have blown it up to the exact dimensions that I want. Now, if you don't have a big fancy screen, this is not a necessary part of the process. In fact, I used to just print out my thumbnail sketches and proceed from this point with tracing paper. And all having it on a screen like this does is it means that I don't have to waste the extra piece of scrap paper that I'm printing this out on, because the tracing paper will work just as easily on either. So I place my tracing paper directly onto my screen here, and I tape it down. And once I have it taped down, then I just go about transferring, sketching, tracing the blocked out thumbnail image into a larger format. And at this point now, I am going to start to concern myself a little bit with some of the finer nuances and details. It doesn't necessarily have to be the finalized thing yet, because in fact, I'm going to be transferring and resketching this one more time in another stage. So this is sort of an in-between sketch phase where it is something more than the thumbnail and something less than the final. And there is the first phase of the transfer done now. I have here the result, which is going to be a rough blocking out of all the forms in the painting. This phase is where I burnish the sketch onto the surface, my watercolor paper. So you see, I've actually taped it down, face down, onto my watercolor paper because I want to transfer the graphite. This is a way of bypassing transfer paper, carbon paper. It means that you don't have to trace over what you've drawn an additional time, well, in addition to what I'm going to do after this as well. So I've just put it down, face down, onto my paper, and then I just rub it with the edge of my fingernail. You don't want to press too hard directly down because then you're going to have some indentations in your paper. But you want to just go just hard enough that as a result of the pressure, the graphite gets transferred. I'll lift this up a little bit to show you. So that's how it looks. Now, one thing you may have noticed now as I'm doing this is that as a result of this process, my sketch has gotten reversed from the original orientation. If you'll remember from my thumbnail drawing, she was facing this direction. Now, if I don't want to have this reversal, I can easily flip it when I'm in Photoshop so that my intermediary sketch would have been drawn facing this way, and then when I flip it again, it returns back to the original orientation. But I actually like doing this, having it go back and forth constantly, because it allows me to gain fresh perspective on the elements of my composition, and it lets me see areas that might need to get worked on or changed before they become more hugely problematic in a later, more difficult to change stage. So this back and forth is actually a benefit to me, I feel. So I basically just go over the whole thing, the entire thing, just burnishing all of it and getting all that graphite transferred over. It's very quick and very easy. I'm going to check and see if it has adequately gone through, and yes, it has. Hooray! A few spots that I didn't quite catch, so I'm making sure those go through. And now it looks like my drawing is transferred. Hooray! Now the next phase is where I go back again with my pencil and really clean up this drawing, because right now it's not optimal. I mean, it's transferred over and I can see everything, but some of my details are not so great. They're a little bit fuzzy. As I said, when I was working on that intermediary sketch phase, that wasn't going to be the end result. And I wasn't really concerned at that point with all the fine nuances, which I am going to be going into at this stage now. And I'm going to really clean up the drawing and have it ready to go on to being painted. One final postscript note before I leave you today. This method that I just outlined for you, if it seems intimidating or overkill, sometimes for certain situations it is a very specific technique that I use when trying to convert a very small thumbnail and through a series of refined sketches, bring it to a final form where I can then proceed to painting it. You'll notice that the initial sketch that I had took very little time, as well as even the intermediary sketch where I used for transferring. Both of those were not where I devoted my energies. My final phase on the final painting surface was what actually took the longest time. And so if you look at it in that way, it's not really that difficult or time intensive of a process, no more so than if you were just to sketch it initially onto the page without any of these other steps. In fact, it's probably easier than that because by the time I get to this point, this stage, I've taken any variations of composition out of the picture, and I'm only concerned with the details and the nuances. Now, if I were to work with something small, for example, a painting like this, I would not use such a technique. I would actually probably just draw this, and in fact I did, just draw this directly onto the paper rather than go through all this back and forth of refining the composition and sketches. If I was to work on something much larger, for example this piece, then again this technique is going to be of a lot of use. So I hope that you found this video to be very informative and that it helps you in your own projects.